Welcome on in, football fans. It's your boy, Gsluke, here with our Monday Night Football preview for the two-game slate tonight, both from the DFS and prop side of things, to get you ready for all of your exposure for tonight. So whether you're out there playing the two-man slate, some showdown for either game, or over there on Underdog or Prize Picks trying to find some prop value out there for tonight's action, gonna have you covered from every single angle. So over there for the two games, gonna talk through some of my projections in ownership, give you a little taste for what to expect from that two-game slate, and on the prop side of things, we're gonna find some of that prop value for you. So I've got 4 props over there in Underdog and Prize Picks that you guys are going to love, and plenty of information and nuggets out there for DFS. So let's not waste any time at all. Go ahead, hop right on in. Starting off with, first off, a look at those projections and how I'm handling this two-game DFS slate. We'll have all of our projections to go through on here, but no player pool notes. And as per usual, those player pool notes are going to be on the Patreon page, but did want to make sure that we could talk through some of the game theory for this evening and how a two-game slate might be different from a main slate or a showdown slate. And I think the best place to start is exactly with that. And I think you have to handle these two-game limited sample size slates as a hybrid between a showdown and a main slate. Of course, the main slate similarities, the parallels are very evident. The same kind of roster construction. You need a defense, you need 3 wide receivers, 2 running backs, a flex, just like you need for the main slate. But when you only have 1-2 games to choose from, correlation is going to be a massive part of the equation. You're going to have some stacks that could go out there and pay off. You kind of have to think about it like you would for showdown, where sometimes you're building for a specific kind of outcome. But obviously it's a little bit different when you have 2 full games to choose from, but you kind of have to take bits and pieces of each type of your process, right? You have a different process for showdown than what you likely have for main slate. You kind of got to marry the two together. So we'll talk about ways that you can do that here, but just wanted to start off with that, as I think I get a lot of questions on these kind of videos and how I'm attacking this slate differently than those other slates. And hopefully that helps you guys with that kind of mindset. But let's start it off with our quarterbacks, where the 2 favorites tonight are going to be where almost all the ownership is going to be. So you probably could have guessed that heading into lock, but over here on the right, you can see I got both the quarterbacks up top, Josh Allen and Joe Burrow, both the favorites in tonight's matchups, over the 30% ownership mark. So starting off right there, that's going to tell us a whole lot about the exposure for all these given teams, and even guys like Jaden Daniels and Trevor Lawrence, who are not slouches by any means out there at the quarterback position, are going to be much lower owned. And we can extend this same kind of idea out there to the other positions, because what you'll see when we go through these projections is that the favorites, the guys that are going to have 4, 5, 6 point favorites out there in certain books, are going to be double, sometimes 3, 4 times higher owned than their options on the other team. So starting off with the quarterbacks, I think Josh Allen, Joe Burrow are in line for a pretty good game tonight. They've got a 46.5 point total in both of the games, so relatively high over under, at least comparatively across the league. And then you've also got these teams with an extremely high team total out there with the 5, 6 point spreads that you have in each game. So Josh Allen with his rushing upside, I think would make a lot of sense. A Joe Burrow actually projects even better than a Josh Allen. That's even without him having as much rushing upside as Josh Allen, because his 1.5 over touchdowns line is like minus 200 towards the over. So obviously the books seem to think that this is a smash game for Joe Burrow. So I don't think that you have to avoid these top 2 quarterbacks. It's just tonight it's going to be all about the kind of contest that you're entering. If you're entering the large field GPP, big 5, $25, something with 50 to 100,000 plus entries, these quarterbacks are going to be really tough to pull off, because even if you get a Josh Allen, right, let's say a Joe Burrow out there at quarterback, a Joe Burrow is probably paired up with an 80% owned Jamar Chase. Even if you're using a Josh Allen, right, you're pairing him up with a 50% owned Dalton Kincaid, you're going to be sharing so much ownership, so much exposure with the rest of the field, that's going to make it tough to move up those leaderboards. So I think that if you're playing single entries, cash, anything smaller than, let's say, 10,000 entries, that these top 2 quarterbacks are probably where I'd go. If I was playing in a single entry tonight, which I will in some of my exposure, it's going to be one of these top 2 guys. But if I was playing against 50,000 plus entries, I would almost certainly be stacking one of these lower owned teams. And though I do think that these favorites are likely going to win tonight, it doesn't mean that that's always going to happen, right? No one has a crystal ball and knows what's going to happen on any given night. And if I was playing in the large field contest, if I knew I had to beat a ton of other people, right? 100,000 other entries, for example. Jaden Daniels with his rushing upside is a perfectly fine play, right? 20 fantasy points is nothing to scoff at compared to the 21.8 and 22 point projections of those top 2 players. He's cheaper. He's coming in at about 1.5 times lower ownership than those top 2 options. And even Trevor Lawrence, the projection's not as great. I mean, obviously cheaper at $5,700, does project for just under 17 fantasy points. He's going to be 3-4 times lower owned than some of the other options up top. top. So I think that tonight your exposure needs to be catered towards the contest that you're entering, because on a 2-game slate, it's kind of like Showdown. It's really easy to go out there and duplicate yourself, especially if you're in one of those large field contests. So tonight, I'm going to have a lot of these top 2 out there in my single entries, probably a little bit more differentiated with some of the bottom options. And just as I said, you want to consider some of the stacks, some of the correlation that you can go after. If you're going to use a quarterback, you likely want to pair him up with some wide receivers, running backs, and tight ends. So we'll talk through some of the options as we go position by position, but whoever you're starting with quarterback is likely going to dictate who you're going with in some of the other skill position spots. In terms of your running backs, you've got a lot of chalk on an Etienne and a Cook. Etienne is not the favorite against the Bills, so I think if there's quote-unquote bad chalk at that position, it might be a Travis Etienne Jr., as he's going to be a little bit game script dependent to go out there and get to that ceiling performance, but because he does have some receiving upside out of the backfield, he's not just a guy that you can cross off with that alone, right? He could still get there with some of that receiving production. It's just that at 62% ownership, that's probably a little bit higher than it should be. So that's my take on it. I'm probably going to be fading Travis Etienne tonight, which of course, check out the Patreon page for what I end up doing with my exposure. But as of right now, especially if he's going to be 60% owned later on, probably somebody I'm actively avoiding. James Cook, on the other hand, they're the favorites out there against Jacksonville. And if you're going to fade Josh Allen, if you're going to take a stance against him, even as, with the Bills as favorites tonight, a way that he could not get to the optimal and still have the Bills win would be James Cook going off, right? If James Cook steals all the touchdowns, it's a lot of rushes by him that go out there and get him those 6 points, then that could be the way that you have to get to that game. And then maybe it's going out there and using Joe Burrow as your quarterback instead, right? And hoping that they have that passing upside. I think that if you're going to fade Josh Allen in lineups, that James Cook would be almost a lock for me in all of those builds. And he's probably my favorite running back towards the top end of the board. Brian Robinson Jr. got a lot of work last week, but he really depends on a close game script. So if you're going to assume that Cincinnati game's maybe a little bit lower scoring, a little bit more competitive than some other people may, then I think Brian Robinson Jr. would make a lot of sense. He'll likely see a larger usage share out there in a close game script. And like I said, a lot of that comes down to the kind of game that you envision going on tonight. Zach Moss, they are the favorites against the Commanders. I would say that Zach Moss is my favorite lower owned, lower priced play out there at the running back position. Maybe lower owned is not the way to put it, because he's still 51.6% owned, but really cheap at $5,600. And you're going to have a lot of salary. These 2-man slates have very, very soft pricing, so you can almost play whoever the heck you want to out there in lineups. So it's not like that's the end all be all, but if you do need a little bit of extra salary to spend up at maybe wide receiver or tight end, it could give you a little bit of extra leeway to go out there and do so. And Austin Eckler has been used a lot when they're playing from behind, most notably in week 1 when they were getting absolutely killed. Austin Eckler had 4 catches out there week 1. So if you're going to play for a little bit of a shellacking out there, maybe you are even playing Zach Moss against the Commanders, Austin Eckler wouldn't be a horrible buyback option, as that receiving upside would be even better if they were playing from behind. Chase Brown, if you for some reason, maybe you're playing some Jaden Daniels lineups tonight and you think that Washington's going to ball out, totally happen, by the way. Large GPP lineups, I will definitely be building that way, especially with the kind of rushing upside that he has. A great buyback in those sort of lineups, if you think that you're going to see some success out there from Washington, then Chase Brown would be a great buyback option. He's that more receiving back out there for the Bengals, is a little bit more shifty than what you have with Zach Moss. And while if Cincinnati's playing from ahead, I fully expect them to try to run out the clock with Zach Moss. If it's going to be competitive or even a negative game script out there for the Bengals, then Chase Brown would be a huge beneficiary. So you're starting to see where these game scripts come into mind, right? You kind of got to think ahead of time, like what you think is going to happen in both games, right? And almost before building a lineup, I think a really good exercise to go out there and build proper lineups is to write down what you think the score in each game is going to be, and then build a lineup based on that score line. So maybe you think the Commanders kill the Bengals, right? I mean, that'd be great for a Steeler fan and me. Go out there, make the Bengals 0-3. If you think that's going to happen, that's going to have a drastic impact on your lineups. Like Chase Brown would be great in that kind of situation, but you know who else would also be great? A Brian Robinson, because of all the extra usage. Planning that out ahead of time, kind of just knowing what you're building for, is I think the easiest way to go out there and build lineups. So hopefully it helps, gives you some perspective on how you can handle those sort of things, but that's how I go after it on this kind of slate. Wide receiver, you got an 80% owned Jamar Chase. That is pretty crazy. T. Higgins is returning from injury and a lot cheaper. He's down there at about 40%. And I think the main thing at wide receiver I want to point out here is first off, correlate it with your quarterback, right? You're using a quarterback, bring at least one wide receiver along with them, if not 2 2 out there in this kind of slate. Main slate, sometimes you get away with a 0 stack, right? Playing a quarterback naked, that is not going to work tonight. There are only 2 games to choose from. And really, the only quarterback that I think you could even argue for playing naked would probably be Jane Daniels because of the price tag and his rushing upside. Outside of him, you should be pairing up with at least one of these wide receivers, if not more than that, because there's only a 2-game sample size. If there's going to be one quarterback that can score 25, maybe even more than that in terms of his fantasy score, then he's likely bringing at least 1-2 wide receivers along with him. Now, in main slate, like I said, sometimes that's not always the case because we'll have like 11, 12 games. That correlation might not matter when you have 12 games and a bunch of different guys that are all going off for 20 plus fantasy points. Tonight, that's probably not the case. There's only 2 games to choose from, right? There's only so many ceiling performances that can go around, which is why that correlation means so much more on this kind of slate. So again, there are parallels to the main slate, parallels to the Showdown slate, but it's a little bit of a different beast when you're dealing with a 2-gamer like this. Terry McLaurin's probably my favorite play on the slate, period. If I had to go out there and just pick one specific player. So yes, he'll be in my player pool. Yes, he will be in my core out here for tonight. What I like about Scary Terry is that if the Cincinnati Bengals are going to control the game, like the game script, the game total would go out there and imply, and he's going to be a huge beneficiary. He got 8 targets last week from Jane Daniels. They seem to be getting along a little bit better, have much better chemistry than what they showed out there in week 1 when he only had 4 targets. So we went from 4 to 8 targets. That's obviously a trend that I'd like to back, and also a game script that could benefit him as well. So you got Khalil Shakir. I think he's an okay play if you're playing some Josh Allen. Really, these wide receivers aren't as interesting, especially when we're talking about strategy, because you don't worry about them from the game script angle as much. I would say if you're going to take a stand, on a team, right, assume that they're going to go out there and really control things, then maybe you bring buybacks back at wide receiver, because if you're playing from behind, if you're playing, down a touchdown or 2, you're likely going to have to throw the ball a lot more than you would otherwise. So that's, I guess, what I would do at wide receiver, right? Whatever team you're really taking a stand on, wide receiver is probably a really good spot to do a buyback. And because you do have Higgins back, I don't like, Yoshi Vosh nearly as much as before. Curtis Samuel's had a really slow start to the year. The wide receivers I really like, right, already mentioned Scary Terry. I think guys like Christian Kirk, he's had a very slow start to this year. Could be somebody to keep an eye on. Probably due for a little bit of regression sooner rather than later. Keon Coleman, I know week 2 was not what we wanted from Keon Coleman. I faded him in my lineup, so I ended up getting the better side of that, but I wouldn't count on that happening going forward. He looked very upset that he wasn't, involved in that offense, and he's a very talented player. So I'd expect that to bounce back. Gabe Davis, you've got a little bit of a revenge game going out there against his former team in Buffalo. Maybe interesting there. Luke McCaffrey has some PPR upside. I'm not nearly, as high on him as some other people are around the industry. Noah Brown, high upside, deep play threat, could be in play out there for the Commanders. Definitely a GPP flyer, if anything, though. And then, anyone else down here? Matt Collins, GPP flyer. Trenton Irwin with Higgins back is probably not as much in play. These would be the kind of options that in the large field GPP you could use to really get different. Now, could they get there? For sure. Honestly, anyone I have on my projections on this sheet could take a big play out there for touchdown. They're all playing snaps if they're out there in my projections. The issue is that you're only using them in very specific spots. And realistically tonight, if you're going to use any of these players, and I'll literally see any, from Gabe Davis and below, it better be like the 50,000 to 100,000 entry contest. You're playing single entry, you're playing cash, you're playing anything smaller than, let's say, even 2,000 entries out there, you're getting way, way too cute if you're playing these kind of players. In terms of projection, look at the points per dollar difference, right? It's less than 1 in a few cases, 1.4x out there to Luke McCaffrey. You have guys well over 2x the whole way up the board. And because pricing is so soft, you're not going to have to force yourself down to these kind of options. So that's why they're going to be so low owned tonight. They're just not worth the price tag compared to some of the other players that you can get to, like on a Showdown slate, for example, right? Some of these guys would be like $200, right? They're $3,000 because of the kind of lineup construction that you have to do with for this kind of slate. That's why in large field GPPs, if you're using some chalk, let's say you're using a Josh Allen stack, maybe you're going with a Joe Burrow stack with some Jamar Chase, a real easy way to just get different and really not have to do much else is to take one of these players, right? Just to hope that you can get that long shot, that flyer, right? Noah Brown scores a touchdown, or Diami Brown goes out there and scores a long touchdown. You could have the keys to going out there and taking down a GPP. So I would say, like I said, single entry, smaller field stuff, don't play these guys. It's just not worth it. But if you are playing the large field stuff, there is a lot of incentive to getting to that kind of player. And finally, we'll look at tight end. Dalton Kincaid, the one real piece of quote-unquote chalk at this position, has got him about 50% owned. So, if you're going to play in the single entry, smaller field stuff, maybe you get away with it, out there at 46%. You're playing some of the, bigger field stuff, trying to go out there, win a GPP. He's not going to give you that differentiation. So still in play, as I mentioned, you can get different out there at the wide receiver if you have to, but Kincaid is not going to accomplish that. Zach Ertz, very meh play, very average play overall. I think if you're going to play some Jane Daniels, you could use him out there as one of your correlation spots. Mike Gesicki, also very meh player, right? Very average start to the year. Not very sexy, not a very high ceiling like you have with these two players. Dawson Knox, I guess, could score a touchdown out there with his limited usage, but also not really that great of a play. So what you can see here at tight end is not a lot of great options. I mean, Brendan Strange, you have Evan Ingram, who's expected to be out tonight. He could be a piece of quote-unquote value at $2,700, but you don't even need that salary. I mean, you can literally pretty much play whoever the heck you want out there at positions, so it's not even like it's all that valuable. I would say at tight end, my favorite play, and it includes price, it includes ownership, would be Eric All Jr. He's extremely athletic. He's the kind of player that I think is going to see a bigger role as the year goes on. In week 2, you started to see it out there from Eric All Jr. Very good tight end at getting yards after the catch, very big, very fast. The kind of player that if he can figure out the mental side of the game, get some of those fundamentals down, maybe become a better pass catcher out there over the next year or so, he could be a Pro Bowl or even an All-Pro level tight end in terms of his receiving upside. So it reminds me a lot of the build of a Jimmy Graham, but maybe even more athletic, which is a very scary prospect. Jimmy Graham, but more athletic, is borderline unstoppable out there in the NFL. In terms of your defenses, I'll show you the ownership here, but it's as expected on those two favorites. Bengals, Bills going to have the highest ownership on the slate, and I guess if you want to get different at the defense, you could do it with the Jaguars or Commanders. And now for the prop side of things, where yesterday our Sunday exposure went unbelievably well. Had a lot of units gained out there on both sites. The 3 slips that we ended up losing for the main slate were all by 0.5 or an injury. So it's safe to say that the prop leans have been on point lately. So let's go ahead and try and keep it going forward. So first off, we got a prop that actually bumped a little bit from where I took it at, but still, I think a solid over that you could consider. And I got Gabriel Davis, I believe it was at 38.5 receiving yards. May even been like 37.5 when I ended up getting it this morning. Patreon page was able to get that number. So of course, guys, right, the place to be is the Patreon page to get all my exposure as I'm getting to it. But the over here for Gabe Davis is very simple. He's been the most targeted wide receiver for the Jaguars so far. More targets than Kirk, more targets than rookie Mike Thomas that everyone thought would be the number 1 wide receiver for this team. So far, it's a small sample size, so things could change going forward. It's not like it's guaranteed he's always going to be the number 1, but it's been Gabe Davis to this point. Tonight, it's a little bit of a revenge game against his former team, the Bills, and he's also playing in a likely negative game script. You've got the Bills as sizable favorites, 46.5 point total, so they're expecting there to be some offense out there in this matchup. And if they're playing from behind, a downfield threat like Gabe Davis is going to see even more usage because of his big body. He's a very fast, big, strong wide receiver that when you're playing from behind is extremely useful to try and generate some offense. That's why I like the over there. So obviously the line was a little bit better for where we ended up getting it, but they ended up bumping this literally as I went to go and record, so not really that much that I can do about it. But even at 40.5, maybe it's not sportsbook line value compared to sportsbooks, but it's still a solid over that you can take. In fact, let me look over here on Underdog. Maybe they still have them at the other number. So if you had to get exposure right now, maybe the better place is over here in Underdog. But let's see. He's at 39.5 here. So maybe a slightly better line. Again, I'd be okay with it on Prize Picks. Still something I took at 37.5. And then you got this Terry McLaurin over at 47.5 yards. He's also been the most targeted player out there for the Redskins, but really didn't see all that usage week 1. Week 1 was his first time out there with rookie quarterback Jane Daniels. Only had 4 targets. Last week was able to get up to 8 targets. And on books, he's at least at 48.5 in all the books that I was checking, if not 49.5 that you saw on a few as well. And including sites like Pinnacle, where he was actually juiced towards the over. And just like Gabe Davis, you've got the Commanders as underdogs tonight, right? They're expected to be playing from behind against the Bengals for at least most of the game if the game script, the line total ends up coming true out there for what we have on Vegas. And so if he's playing from behind, he's one of those deep play kind of wide receivers, not as big and strong as a Gabe Davis, but very athletic, capable of going up and high pointing the football. This is the kind of player that would see a huge boost from that kind of script. So that's why I took his over. Same thing with Gabe Davis. Again, the place to be to make sure you can get these before they move is over there on the Patreon page, and link in the description description of the video to go out there and join that. Just $15 a month gives you access to all the slips I'm entering and all the prop value that we can get as soon as it drops. And then over here on Underdog, I have the other two teams that we haven't talked about. So these are the two underdogs, right? Jacksonville and the Commanders. Now we've got the two favorites, and it's a real simple process. Over on rushing attempts for Zach Moss at 13, and I also got James Cook over 14.5. Now that moved up to 15, so that's why I pulled a little bit of an audible here. And by the way, I literally posted those on Patreon page at like 1:10, so it's within 20 minutes that these are bumping, right? So obviously, with the run that we've been on, the kind of ROI that we've posted so far this year, they're not letting these sit around too often. So if you want everything that I took myself, that's the place to be. But 64.5 is like not the worst line for James Cook. I was looking at him for an over at 63.5, so this bumped up 1 yard since the last time I was looking at it. I like the 14.5 rushing attempts a little bit more, because if they're going to play from ahead, they're going to try and pound out that clock, pound the rock a little bit to go out there and get the clock moving. But this 64.5 rushing yards prop is a lot of the same, right? If they're going to rush the ball a lot, try and go out there and control the time of possession, that's going to be huge for that kind of spot. So I took that. This over in Zach Moss, he's at 13.5 on DraftKings. Last time I checked, he was actually minus 120 towards the over. He was at 12.5 on FanDuel, but he was minus 140 towards the over, which is about the most juice that FanDuel will put on a prop before going out there and just outright bumping it to the next number. So I think you're getting a little bit of sportsbook line value on the Zach Moss prop, and just like Cook, you know, if you got the Bengals playing from ahead, controlling most of this game, then they're going to run out the clock. And I guess the issue for Zach Moss, why you'd be, a little bit hesitant to take this over, is weeks 1 and 2. James Cook, not so much, right? He saw plenty of those touches weeks 1 and 2. In fact, they blew out a few teams, so far to start the year. Zach Moss, not so much. They've been playing from behind. He's had horrible game scripts weeks 1 and 2, which is why I think this prop is so soft. I mean, over there with the Colts, when he was the featured running back for them, he was seeing well over 20 carries a game. So for a team that is huge favorites tonight, I think we could see that kind of game from the Bengals running backs. Now, you still got Chase Brown. He's going to take a few rushes away, but I could see them getting 25 rushing attempts as a team. And if that's going to happen, that's putting Zach Moss at, 18, 19 per game at that kind of projection. So again, two overs that I like. Make sure to go ahead, check out the Patreon page for all my exposure. That's all I've got out here for Monday Night Football. Alrighty, guys, that is all I've got for the preview tonight. Go ahead, smash that like button if you guys haven't already, and also subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of the content to come. Gonna have some President's Cup stuff dropping throughout the week, so if you're a golf fan, make sure to stay tuned for all of that, as well as our Thursday Night Football preview, main slate out there for week 4, also Monday Night Football for week 4 as well, and content throughout the rest of the year. So you guys know the deal. Content going to be very consistent here on the channel here in 2024, and let's go out there and have ourselves a night. Best of luck, whether you're entering those GPPs, trying to take down a contest, or trying to win some 50-50s or cash lineups, and over there on the prop side, Underdog Prize Picks, best of luck over there as well. For a chance to earn a free month on my Patreon page, you guys can go ahead, try and give me the top fantasy score tonight. And if you can get that score and their score within 2 fantasy points, you'll win a free month on my Patreon page. So go ahead, claim your player, give me your best guess down below. And by the way, if it ends up being a few people that get the same player and the guess within like 2 points, it's going to be whoever has the closest guess. So go ahead, claim your player and score down below, and let's go ahead and have ourselves a night. I appreciate you guys. Make sure to check out the Patreon page as well if you want the spreadsheets, all of my player pool out there for tonight on DFS, and for all the different prop exposure I'm getting to. So we've got 2 slips in already. Those are the 2 slips that I posted there on the Patreon page, but probably more exposure to come throughout the evening. So for all of that, that's the place to be for that. Appreciate you guys. As I said before, best of luck with your exposure, and let's get it.